Welcome to What Would Sabrina Say? I'm Sabrina Dong, and I'm excited you're joining me today. In this podcast, I dive into mental health topics on relationships, and overall well-being. With over 20 years of experience as a licensed clinical social worker, I share insights and invite expert guests who are passionate about making a positive difference. I started this podcast because I was frustrated with the often misleading or recycled information in social media involving self-help and in the mental health field. My goal is to provide you with genuine, useful content that's educational and informative. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you find our conversations both enlightening and empowering. I'm glad you're here. Hi, Sherry. Thank you so much for being here today. Just to introduce yourself, we have Sherry Seymour here. She is a trauma coach. So excited to have you to talk about, understand what a trauma coach can do and how to help a person experiencing trauma. We're hearing a lot about trauma these days, which is great for people to have access to information and resources out there. And just wanted to talk about, again, what are some ways that you can help. So thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Sabrina. I really appreciate it. So I have my business name is Beyond Wishful Thinking. I am a life coach in Canada, Ontario, and I really just evolved into trauma. And like you said, I hear so much about it like everyone else is, and really wanted to just really dig in and get a sense of it and help people because so many needs that aren't being met are because of trauma and we don't even know it.
Right.
And so that's what drew me to that. I have certifications in parenting and relationship coaching, energy coaching. I can do group coaching. There's a lot of things I can do. But the trauma piece is where I've kind of gone back to school and I'm doing a lot of work and studying with some of the leading names, Frank Anderson, Janina Fisher, Bessel van der Kolk. And I'm really just soaking all of that up right now and managing to infiltrate that into my coaching business.
And it's great to expand the profession and include coaches. I think that's really important and it's really great to see. Again, we're seeing so many ways that people can be supported and helped on this journey. And it doesn't necessarily have to be under the medical hierarchy or umbrella as in the past.
Yes. And I think what's fascinating about that is many of the therapists, some of those names I just mentioned, they themselves have moved away from what they learned as far as the boundaries that we put around diagnoses. And so it's very exciting when I go on these webinars and classes to be able to tick off my designation of coach and to be very accepted. At first, it's actually a little humbling, and you can sort of be speaking with these people, raise your hands, and I tended to be, well, I'm a coach, not a therapist. And they're, oh, welcome, welcome. There's a whole new movement around the idea that what we once thought kind of isn't that way anymore. And these are the therapists that have, after many years of experience, some of them from the 60s through, are saying that this isn't what we once thought, and we want to look at it with fresh eyes and fresh attitudes. And so it's really exciting to be able to be in that forum as a coach.
And using that holistic approach. And I'm wondering if you could share what brought you to being a trauma coach, and perhaps we can just talk about even what trauma is as well.
Okay. So the basic definition around trauma that I appreciate is that it's any event that deeply disrupts your sense of safety or your sense of self. And, there could be a lot of people thinking, yeah, I can buy into that. But what does that mean? I think I had a good childhood. I haven't had any major disruption in my life. But anything that we find that has a lasting effect. So I think one of the most simple things I like to think about when people think they've had a good life, and if they think that they have, so that I don't want to debunk that. But there are times where we could say to somebody, if you were a super sensitive child raised in a home with two parents who were like super dynamo, maybe you didn't get the needs met that you needed met. And maybe you don't even know that because what you had was okay, but you still have this sense of not belonging. I don't know who I am. And so trauma can really be a very hard to fathom thing until we start learning about it more. So that's one thing. It can be acute from a single event. It can be chronic from repeated events. And it can be complex because it involves multiple trauma over time. So when children live in poverty or their abandonment, those kinds of things, that gets referred to as developmental trauma. So while our brains are developing, everyone has heard that, that from birth to six is so important. And if you're living in trauma, then how your brain forms changes. So that's kind of what we refer to as developmental. But then you can have a horrific fire or a car accident. Some people just watching our world on the news, that can be traumatic because they maybe lived in a world where they never thought harm could come to them. And
Right.
now they're realizing, oh, wait, what I once thought isn't true. And so that can even be trauma. So you can see it's multifaceted, and we don't want to diminish somebody's trauma that's just debilitating. But
Hmm.
we'd also like people to understand that trauma comes in many levels and forms, and that on some level, we all have a sense of it in our lives.
Right. As human beings to experience some type of significant event, or I think sometimes understanding even what, psychological abuse looks like and as a form of trauma.
Yes.
And even these historical definitions of trauma going back to, supporting soldiers in the Vietnam War, etc. It was more around these, extreme, intense, significant events that bring on fear and terror. It doesn't ever apply to everybody's day to day or, again, childhood experiences. And we still don't have diagnosis of trauma for children. So, again, many ways we've come a long way, but I think there's other ways that the field is still growing.
And I think, like you said, in those days when we think about the war, Vietnam is a big one that people talk about. The trauma that created for those people was debilitating.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes we get stuck there that it must be debilitating before I can be sort of named as having trauma. And I think that's one of the things we want to debunk a bit, that it can simply be maybe the same relationship you're always picking that isn't working because there was trauma around a need that you don't even understand that you have yet because you're just living out of habit. And that's trauma too.
And I think that's a way that having support from a professional, using that secure, neutral space can help to process things or understand the experiences. Because there are some people out there who might have experienced neglect and don't even see it as that or know, right?
I love that example because neglect we often think of as very harsh, but
Hmm.
neglect can simply be a very quiet child who nobody draws out.
Right.
And that child just sits quietly, kind of in the corner, so to speak. And they're not horribly treated by society standards, but nobody knows them because they didn't seek them out.
Mhm.
I agree. I think that there's so much of that. So it's important that trauma responses are adaptations that our body and mind create to survive. So any of these situations that we've just talked about, that's what trauma does to us is we make new patterns, we make new choices, we kind of start to govern our bodies in a way that protect us even if we're not aware of it.
Right. And especially, involving our nervous system. And there's so much out there sharing about the fight or flight response or hypervigilance, hypovigilance, and learning more about fawning. That's fairly new. And people pleasing that could be seen as a strength, being kind to others, helping others. But it's actually this trauma response of, always making sure other people's needs are before their own.
I like that point too. We get to, because of social media, we get to learn a lot, but we're learning, just like you said, a title, fight or flight or fawn. What does that really mean? And disassociative. Everybody may have a thought about what that means, but it can mean so many different things depending on the circumstance. And that's why seeking professionals is a good idea, because you can sort of have a sense that by what you're seeing on social media, you can say, oh, maybe that does apply to me, but somebody can help you really look at what you are doing and help you identify it for you specifically. It's almost like if we get a title, we just accept the title, but we don't change, we just keep moving. And we want to help people understand what that means. For me, one of the neat little learnings I had that just fascinates me is the amygdala, the reptile part that holds the emotions and keeps us safe. If we are truly in a high fear, like maybe a tiger or a lion is about to attack, our body actually starts to run before our brain tells us our body is going to run. And I always like to explain that. To me, that's fascinating because we don't have a sense of that.
No.
But that's what's happening. And so body awareness is huge. And I know there's a level where some people, myself included, once upon a time would have went, ugh, yeah, I'm not into that. But it is a part of all of the awareness of learning about what we need.
Right. This the body and mind are so interconnected. And I think there's lots of focus on our heads. Our floating heads, like thoughts, awareness, reducing anxiety, reducing stress, and again, incorporating the body along with, because like you said, there's lots of times with our brain being so complex, we're picking up using our senses in the environment of cues, of assessing situations, and there is a big part of just being able to go into our bodies, which can be hard for some people who've experienced trauma as well.
I know that was really hard for me. I know that being somebody who just kept moving, I came through the social service system as a child. I certainly know what abandonment feels like. I've had many deaths much earlier than other people. A lot of people have left, and I have done decently well as far as society would look at me and think, you did it. But no real ability until I took all my courses to really understand what looking inside meant. And the idea of being aware of, why do you feel that way? Or do you even feel about something? Even like not feeling about something, absence of that is just as important as maybe intense feelings. And I remember the very first time I did a yoga class, and I was so angry that I was kind of being forced into it because somebody thought it would be good for me. And I went and I cried every time they asked us to breathe. And I remember realizing that was very fascinating because what I didn't understand, I was in my 40s at the time. And what I didn't understand was I'd basically been holding my breath. I get to choose when I breathe is how I felt. And as silly as this is going to sound, it was fascinating once I realized about breathing and being aware of it, how much easier just daily living was because I could learn to let out a breath or bring in a breath. And when you haven't experienced it, it can sound a bit like, really, breathing? But it was earth-shattering for me to understand the concept of technically holding my breath, keeping it very close, because that was how I was protecting myself.
So, yoga sound like it helped you to notice maybe the protective responses in ways you might have been carrying
I
your
only
body.
did that one class. I
Okay.
haven't done it again because it was a lot, but what I was so grateful to learn was just to be aware of my breath. I had a lot of other things I've done since then to try to be aware of that. I have a certification in energy coaching, the chakras, like I've learned so much. But yoga, I haven't done. I just found it so fascinating that that was the first thing that taught me that something as simple as breath had so much impact and power. We
Hey,
know that logically because if we don't have breath, we're dead, like obviously. But there's just this difference of controlling it. It's mine, right? I get to choose how it enters my body and what it's like. And that, to me, that just seems so simplistic to say the words, but until you have an experience, Robert Littman is an author who does a lot of work around breathing. And I've taken a couple of his classes, and he'll just say, just notice the breath under your nose.
mhm,
Where a lot of places they want you to take a deep breath in and they want you to let a breath out and they want it to be done with noise. And
right.
I resist that. I still struggle with that. But his was so interesting because he wasn't forceful. And for some people, that's huge. And so, yeah, it's just a real simple little, it's about our bodies. It's integrating with our mind, being asked questions like a coach can sort of say to you, hey, where do you feel that in your body? We don't do that for ourselves the same. We just feel it.
Mhm.
But a coach can say, can you explain where you feel that? And I love when I have clients that seem almost surprised. That's right in my throat. One of my chakra classes I did, there was a woman who was kind of admitting she wasn't really into this, but she was curious. And when we sort of got to the throat chakra, she started to choke, coughing and speech. She was, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I need to get a glass of water. I don't know why this is happening. And we can say, well, we're working on your chakra. That's your throat. What do you think it wants to tell you? And she discovered a whole thing around her and her sister. So it's really neat to see people learn that.
Yes, and different methods that you can use, right? Again, just depending on, preferences or openness to things. But yes, our body does tell us things, right? tightened jaw, shoulders up, right? Intense. And sometimes we don't even pay attention to what's happening and how we're carrying our face, our eyes, like what's happening there in different parts of our bodies, right? Usually just if there's a pain or other sensation. So I think it's with trauma support, counseling and coaching, it helps people be more aware of their bodies and how they can experience the world as well too.
And that it's okay to, right? That it's okay to. We weren't raised with self-awareness, a lot of us.
Or even an
And
understanding what the self is.
yeah, that's one thing Janina Fisher says that I absolutely love. Our self cannot be traumatized. And she also refers to when bad things happen and we get up the next day and we move on with our life. She calls that the going on with normal self, normal life self. And so that's the part of us that people think, well, I feel like I've been traumatized. It's that part of us that knows we have to keep moving. That's our self, and it can't be traumatized. And sometimes it can feel like that to our mind or the way we feel about things, because we feel almost like our self turns its back on us in a sense. That idea of that we're left struggling to figure it out, but the self is what keeps us moving. I don't know.
Right.
I found that encouraging. It felt encouraging to me to know that there was a part of my being that can't be traumatized. And its job is to keep me safe. And that's really cool. And
Right.
I think you're so right that we don't really have self-awareness.
And again, our idea of self or self identity, I think it gets really confusing, especially with messages out there. And
Yes.
it's really exciting to learn about the self and about our values, about different parts of us, how we protect ourselves. Again, that part of us that has us make move forward. There's a lot of talk as well about the word resiliency. Been out
Yes.
there for some time, right? Do we use that? Do we not use it? We'll talk a bit about that as well too. But in terms of healing from trauma and the journey and what that looks like. But I think it's also helpful to talk about too what trauma is not. Because I think again, with a lot of psychological terms, labels, mental health talks out there, sometimes there is, some misunderstandings about what trauma is, right? And I think,
Yes.
we're seeing it as a disappointment, being offended.
Yes. Well, so one of the things that we didn't really talk about this in the past, I'm curious what you think about this. I know that people refer to trauma as big T and little t trauma. And
Right.
when I first heard that, it just didn't resonate with me. And so I was
Mhm.
very happy to get involved in some of these well-renowned people, and most of them don't like to use big T, small t, because it just seems like something that might have happened to you as a child that isn't what other people consider a high-end trauma, that somehow it means that you need to just forget about it. And so that isn't terminology I like to use. I understand that somehow people wanted to not be taking away from other people's trauma. So maybe a soldier who's done something that none of us could ever imagine doing. So then we don't want to think that the car accident that really rattled our world is equal. And I think what we want to understand is it doesn't matter what the trauma is, if it has stopped your normal living and your normal ability to be able to do what you want in your life, it is trauma. But you're right. Disappointment isn't trauma with children and teens, maybe when they're a little angsty and they think that being barred from going to the party they want, their life will never be the same. That's disappointment. And disappointment is a human who feels that they had a set of ideals that aren't going to come to fruition. That's different than trauma. And sometimes disappointment as human beings is what we learn about ourselves from. The teenager who thinks, well, my goodness, I can't go to that, may discover later when something horrible happened that they were saved from, that sometimes there's reasons for things, and disappointment is healthy. We want people to understand that trauma is what stops us from living and moving forward. And we don't need to diminish what happens to somebody as not trauma if it doesn't meet what we feel that is.
Right. And again, it's okay to have different feelings on, situations or experiences and get support. And it's going to look differently. And I think sometimes loss is being labeled as trauma, and not all loss or not all grief is trauma,
Yes.
which
Do you
David
know?
Kessler talked about, but all trauma has a piece of grief to it there.
Yeah, we just really need to understand that everything that we feel that feels like it's too much, we have a right to get help for.
Yes.
We can't define for someone else. We live in an era where, because we know so much more, I feel like I sometimes hear comments of some people that, well, what's all this about trauma? Because something all of a sudden becomes very known. We did fine before we knew this definition. What's the issue? But I want people to really understand that the more we can learn, the closer we can step into having relationships that actually feel good for everybody. And so let's not resist new terminology, and let's not cling to old terminology. One of the things we talked about a minute or two ago made me think of the IFS journey with Dick Schwartz and Frank Anderson. The idea of ourselves being a family, and all parts of us throughout our whole life have had a part in building who we are. And so we can start to look inward once we get used to that, and start looking for the things that maybe we really do know that we have a need that wasn't met, but maybe we don't think we have a right to speak of it. And so being able to kind of go inside and sort of start understanding where we feel like we're just a little heavier and unable to push through.
I think sometimes we get focused on, if I only knew this information before, life would have been better. Or I wish I could turn back and be able to do things differently, or I don't think I can now. And it's also challenging those thoughts around healing, that it's never too late
Yeah.
to live life how we're wanting, or how the self is trying to move us forward towards doing and receive whatever it's connection, love, whatever it is. And I think, again, there's a stuckness about not being whole or able to, achieve things after experiencing types of trauma.
Yes, I agree. I believe now, through a lot of the learning I've had, that when we're ready to handle more, our body will free it for us. I think sometimes if we had maybe had an understanding, we might not have had the space or the ability to do anything with it. And maybe that would have been more traumatic. And so it's easy to see. So there's that grief, right? I don't think we can live any life from beginning to end and not think that there would have been nice knowledge to have had. And maybe that's, well, not maybe, that is the journey. The journey is to be willing to say, I did the best I could with what I had at the time, and to forgive ourselves for what we didn't know, and to try and give ourselves what we can with what we start to learn. Maybe
Exactly.
that's too wide, too broad a stroke, but I know I've grieved a lot of things, and I have both biological parents are gone, and my sister that I went through foster care with is gone. And I really wish I could talk to them now. There was a beautiful thing I watched with Terry Real, where there was a woman who wanted to do something with her future, but she felt that her ancestors would be disappointed. And he did a meditation with her and asked her if she would be open to considering that her ancestors were there in front of her, and what might they say. And it was a bit of a meditation, but it ended up being that they were basically saying to her, we lived so you could live. So live to your fullest.
Right.
And when we speak about generational trauma, there's so much that comes with that. Even if we had family members or people who couldn't give us what maybe deep down in they really wanted to. We have life now, so it's never too late. But find someone to help you grieve what you had a right to, and
Mhm.
hug or grasp or become what you are able to be now. And that's the gift to you for yourself. I don't think it's ever too late.
When you think of intergenerational traumas where people feel helpless, there's nothing I can do. This is my fate. This is what I've been dealt with. This is my family lineage. Hearing information out there that could be pretty intimidating or scary, like you're doomed. This isn't going to change for you or other generations. And it's unfortunate because there's interventions that can help to heal, process, to rewire the brain.
Yeah. That's very exciting too, the rewiring of the brain. I think that's something people don't fully understand is that the neural pathways in our brain, they can change. It seems like everybody knows what the frontal cortex is and what it does, but we don't really fully understand as a lay person without doing some work, just the depth of how we can recreate brain pathways. And that's also really exciting to be able to help clients understand. In Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, he speaks about a therapist in London, Ontario, I believe, who did some research with a couple who had been in a horrific car accident that was a multi-car pileup on the 402 here in Ontario. Her frontal cortex and her brain was mostly white and his was very red. And people said, well, I thought in panic, your frontal cortex shuts down. And well, sure it does. His was red because the whole time he was planning, how will I get out of the path of the car? No, we're trapped. How will I get out? The fascination is in understanding and wanting clients to know that nothing's permanent, right?
Right. That's important
Yeah.
takeaway.
And we can readjust, we can relearn, we can get new strategies, we can heal, we can grieve. And that's very exciting when you realize that there are tools to do that.
I think, like you said earlier, when we're doing the day to day, it's survival mode. And that's different from being able to live a quality of life, right? You're wanting in terms of connecting people, the types of relationships, the routines of the day, achieving goals maybe with career. Some things can still be achieved on survival mode, really, and not healing so much.
100%. And I think survival mode looks like, I was just saying this the other day, and this is just my own theory, but when you think of survival, everybody sort of looks at that as like a finish. Like we often hear, "Oh, you survived." And survival would indicate life, right? And so if we think about that going on with normal life part of ourselves, that's really what survival is that part of ourself that just keeps moving forward and does the day-to-day necessity. But that doesn't mean that you have fullness of life or that you have connection. And so I think the healing begins somewhat when we have time or space or somebody, if you feel unhappy or unconnected, then go and find somebody. And it doesn't mean that you're depressed or suicidal or anything. You could be those too. And that's like obviously help there. But I'm just thinking about the day to day. We don't have to wait till we have time.
Hmm.
But we do want to, we live in a world now where we're more able to speak of things than we ever have been. And I just feel like get some good books and read and start to understand the patterns that you have. And then you could maybe start to understand, okay, I would like more. I want to go deeper. I want to understand things. I think we live in a society where we're supposed to just move forward a bit. And so if you're doing that, people think you're okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share what trauma coaching can do or help there when it comes to integrating trauma and what that approach looks like.
I think trauma coaching allows people a safe place to explore their own self with somebody who has the ability to identify for them so they can speak a story and someone who has studied and learned a little bit about it can put a name to it. And when I just had something recently where I suggested to someone that an addiction that had been in their past was because they were looking for connection. and their extreme relief about the concept that they could forgive themselves because they now understood that all they were doing was seeking connection. But we don't figure those things out on our own because we get so mired in our misery. We're so busy and we're moving. And so just to come and learn about, why is this thing I want so difficult for me? And here's what I feel and think. And then somebody can just guide them. It's, almost like having a good friend to talk to, but it's better because your friend is only going to tell you what you want to hear a lot of the time, unless they're really right. Where a therapist and a coach can say, I really hear that. Tell me how you feel. What would you like different? And here's some ways that you can maybe make that happen. Where our friend, our family, they're going to say things like, well, you know what? I had that hard time too, but I'm okay now. Or, that feels like a lot and I don't know how to help you. So I'm just going to make a joke. Where a coach can sit down and really make you feel comfortable in being able to say, I don't think I want what I have, or I want more, or I just need this to change. And how can we look at that? It's just really solid. Somebody who's going to take the time to give you the safe place to find out what you are feeling and whether you can do anything different about it. Does that resonate at all?
Yes, it does. So just again, having that safe space to have a witness to
Yes, I
what you've
love that word.
experienced.
Talked briefly, and we want to just make sure people understand too, there's variations in therapy and coaching and all of that. I think I have about 7 different certifications, but I'm not licensed, so it's all the verbiage and language. And I kind of went online one day and took a look and went, oh my goodness, it's not represented well. So you certainly want to look into people's education and make sure that they do have a knowledge that they can share with you versus just trading internet memes and having a talk about what we think things mean. Coaching is something that's really easy to sometimes call yourself. So just really make sure when you're looking for someone that you ask about their experience so that you can get a sense. And that goes the same for therapists too. Unfortunately, therapy has been something that's been geared a certain way over the years. And there are some therapists out there that charge a lot of money and people come away feeling almost more traumatized. So if you don't feel good where you go, don't keep going, find somewhere else until you get the help you need.
Yeah, it's exploring options. Also helpful to, communicate where things are at for you in an appointment or session, whether it's with a coach, a therapist, saying like, I don't feel that's it, or I'm not, comfortable going there,
Yes.
whatever it is, right? And I think sometimes people just don't know what to expect, don't know what they can ask or say. And so again, it's okay to communicate where things are at or
One of the most exciting things a client will say to me is, no, that's not it. And I love that because I'm like, okay, good. Check. It's not that. All right, tell me more. Where are we heading? What do we want? You don't like a therapist or a coach should not be taking anything personally. Our job is to help you. And so if you tell me that that's not how it sits with you, all that does is help me know that that's one less thing and tell me more.
it's problem solving together, right? It's not coming to someone to say, direct me how to get rid of this trauma, and isn't there a formula or outcome
Well,
solution to do, right?
yeah,
It's
and you
about
talked
the
about that.
process.
Yes, you talked about that earlier, healing. There's the healing gives us a sense that there will be a cure. And a cure can feel like there is no record, like if you're thinking about trauma and there's stitches and there's a scar kind of thing. People think healing means that there's no evidence that there was ever an issue. And that is not the case with trauma. And I don't think we want that to be the case because you know what? Some of what we learned through trauma is what made us who we are. And I sometimes wonder, who would I be if I had had what I thought I wanted? Not that I want to live in trauma. I just mean, who we are, we are what we live to a certain extent. So what we want is for those things, those triggers, those things that happen, we just want them to not derail us. We want to know how to recognize them. We want to know how to say, I know what that's about, and have a different strategy so that we can be the best person we can be.
Yeah, and Frank Anderson, psychiatrist, recently talked about that. I saw one of his reels, right? That trauma is events that we have experienced, but that's not that should define us. And healing is a process for sure. It's not a finality, it's not an outcome. And I think that can be a hard one for many. It's like, well, what does healing look like? What should I expect?
Yeah, for me, I think healing just means that I understand myself better and that what created the disconnection is no longer in control. The idea that the things that poke at the wound, so to speak, and then the wound becomes painful. Healing looks like the wound not becoming quite so painful.
Right. So you can revisit those moments without experiencing pain, without experiencing such a reactive response. It feels different.
Yeah. And I also think on some level, our trauma helps us in how we make our decisions now. So you don't want to become a blank slate, right? It's a part of you. There are things that happen to us in life that we don't want to erase, but we do want to be able to live with. And that to me is the beginning of what healing can look like.
Right. So trauma support intervention counseling is not about erasing it,
No,
about
not for
acting like
me.
it happened.
If somebody came to me and said, when will I no longer remember or feel this, that would become a part of what we would talk about for sure, because it's not like that.
Right.
And I honestly don't think we want it to be.
And how would we, when a person get unstuck, right? Because sometimes with trauma, we feel stuck, or even just issues that we have difficulty coping with. We feel stuck, helpless, can't see an end in sight. What are some ways that we can get unstuck? What's the first step?
Well, we already sort of talked about self-awareness. Unstuck is a word that I struggle with from time to time because it's one of those overused ones, and yet people can understand it. I've used it too. I wonder now, though, with some of the education I've had recently, is if we want to refer to unstuck as just the beginning of being self-aware. This idea that we wake up, we look around maybe, and we think, how did I end up here? Right? If I'm not happy, why? And so it's almost like there's movement wanted, which I guess in sense is unstuck. But I just try to shy away from some of the words that we just get so used to hearing that we're not sure. So unstuck to me just means that I'm not growing, I guess. I'm not moving forward. And what can I do about that? Well, I think we've kind of covered all of those ideas with self awareness, getting help, being willing to understand that even if other people don't think I have a problem, that's not for them to decide. Moving forward sometimes means different people, and that can be difficult. But we may be with those people because we just don't think we have any other options. And so I think it's just unhappiness maybe initially, or just the feeling that I think at different stages in our life, we just sort of wonder, why am I here? We all had dreams. We all have ideas. And that might be our guide is to sometimes, in different facets of my life, we've done things like dream boards. And when I fostered, I was always fascinated how children didn't know how to play. Most of my foster kids were hard to manage kids. We worked through an agency that did that. And I had one child who didn't know how to laugh. And when you see that, and then imagine if they don't get to learn that, and then they're now 30 or something, there might come a point in life where people just start to see life differently for whatever reason. And that's when they want to say, could there be more? How do I get that? Look for help, do the best you can. So I don't know if I'm answering the question succinctly enough, but coaches and therapists, they can identify patterns, help you build skills. They can help you learn how to regulate emotions. If you're tired of always being sad, we can sort of bring in different speak about emotions. Some people don't even know how to identify emotions.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it's like, where do we learn this from? Right? Where do we learn it? It's not really taught.
No, and if you don't have the freedom to do something as simple as play, I know people were shocked when I would tell them that I had to teach children how to play. But modeling,
It's a way of kids' ability to process and explore their world, to problem solve, to work through things, to communicate.
And to be able to be the same. And as society, I wish we could become less shocked and more willing to understand and to make movements to change that, right? So that you've
Right.
got your traumatized world, and then you have a world that I don't know if people always want to hear about trauma, because it might mean their life has been pretty good and what could they do differently, maybe? I don't know. But we need it to be not so commonplace that people think every little thing is trauma, but more commonplace that it's comfortable, and comfortable for the traumatized. It's hard to talk about things that aren't the norm.
Sure. A social worker I was trained by, around trauma assessment and intervention for children and adults, Geraldine Crishy back in Toronto, would share, if everything's trauma, there is no trauma.
Yeah, that's what, thank you. That's much better words for what I was trying to say. Yes.
So it's about, again, having that awareness, understanding, sharing knowledge to inform, finding people around to have that knowledge and expertise to help with coping, regulating.
So we talked about grief briefly. And I would say one of the things that I found about grief that's really difficult, and I think most people who've experienced it would agree, that the person grieving has the harder job because they have to help the person who's never grieved understand. And it's the same for trauma. That's what I was trying to say too, is when somebody sees that maybe you're different or you don't have the same stories to tell, you either become quiet because you don't want them to feel bad, or if you speak it, so that's the same thing you referred to. And we just want there to be more awareness of the work that is on the traumatized person's part and see if we can help alleviate that. And I think that's where coaching and therapy can also be a good thing, right? Because the more you speak about something, the more you learn about how to speak about it too. And then it gives you more power around your own story.
Definitely. It is, rewriting that narrative. And it's so important to know that it can be a different message, that whatever you've been receiving by the trauma or traumas in your life. And, grieving is hard because that's another thing that our society is not comfortable with. People are quick to try to make you happy, laugh, change the subject, move on, from, instead of allowing yourself to process losing, significant people in our lives, or whatever loss that we've experienced from trauma, and being able to mourn that. That's also part of healing.
Yeah, they really do kind of go hand in hand as far as the healing part of it, the grief and the trauma. And I think too, I love what we just spoke about the story, the narrative. Sometimes when people hear a story, they think it's a lie, but it's not. The story is how we imagined or dealt with our perception at the time. So I know with some of the people I work with, once they're ready, you wouldn't start this right out of the gate, but once they're ready to start looking at their narratives and what their story means, there's a really neat sense of healing that happens when they can say, oh, isn't that interesting? So my parent didn't do that to me. My
Right.
parent didn't have the ability, or they never had, or my grandparents, and they start to understand that it isn't because they themselves are a bad person or that they
Hmm.
themselves somehow brought this on. And there's just such a freeness about being able to forgive that person even. I remember when I went
Yes.
back, so I was taken into care when I was around 7. I went back when I was 19. We were not in the era of open adoptions, so I had to go and piece everything together by my own memory. And I lucked out that there were the odd person at a children's aid office that would sort of say, well, I'm not really supposed to tell you this, but if you went and looked here, you might find this. When I went back and actually met my mother at my grandparents', she acted like I had just been at the store. There was no emotion. It was like, oh, hey, how are you? And I remember going home at the end of that and thinking to myself, she is a product of her family. And there was nothing that she could do differently. And I'm grateful I could see that. But then I also had this next step of understanding that I can choose to cling to that story and feel sorry for myself and have people think, that's really hard. No wonder you find it difficult to do fill in the blank. Or I could decide to be different. And I just decided, and I literally had a moment where I imagined throwing crutches away. It was kind of strange at the time, but I kind of pictured it as that. I think a little bit in metaphors just naturally because they seem to some kind of come easy. And I just decided that was it. I wasn't going to have that as a crutch. I wanted to be me. And that was the beginning of me at least understanding that I could change my future.
Right. And kind of letting your mom own that. You're able to witness and experience and understand intergenerational trauma or seeing how she's been affected in her life, but it just not owning and carrying that with you.
Now, that means that I still had lots of other things. So I just don't want people to think one metaphor and one realization will mean that you're not kind of blocked, but it was a
Right.
beginning of at least stepping out on my own. I'm in therapy myself for the first time for probably not quite a year, and I'm fascinated at the things that I'm starting to learn and can say, okay, that makes more sense. And so it's almost more the beginning of now putting into place the rest of the story. And it's strengthening.
It's strengthening, it's empowering to see that you're in control of your own life. And a lot of times we feel that we need the other person who's done the wrong, the harm, whichever, as part of this process for healing, for closure. And we don't always get that, or they're not always going to see their part or experience.
That's the hardest one. I feel like on some level I could do the work without, because there's been some sexual abuse and some of those people are still around, and I've chosen how to handle contact. And I know I hear that idea that I don't need forgiveness, all of those things, but there is still a journey in that. I just want people to know that you're right. It's true. Everybody that says that, it's accurate, but there is still a process in how you want to handle that. But I think the gift in knowing that is that you get to do it in your own time. If we had to think that we needed to have that other person, that would be so distraught filled for people because they don't always have access.
No, and then what do you do? Right?
Right. So that's where the narrative and the storytelling comes in. And again, I want to keep reiterating, I don't mean storytelling where we make up something. It's not fake. It's just the realization of how we get what we need to be able to process and live in our own body. And we do not need that other person to do that. There are beautiful stories. Sometimes people say to me, what was the story of when you met your mother? And I often will preface with, those ones you see in magazines and TV they are the anomalies. A lot of regeneration and meetups are just, yeah, okay, no, I'm where I should be. They were really scary people. They were this, they were that. But yet society still loves the end of a good story. So write the end of your own story and know that the ones that we see are the few and far between, the glory ones. The rest are just reality. And we need to take possession of our own selves and decide how we want our story to end. And we don't need that person who was so not good to us to be a part of that story. But it's hard to let go of that. And that's okay that it's hard to let go of it. But just know that when you finally get it, you'll get it. You'll understand. Just know that the people who are saying that understand that we don't need those people. But I just really feel badly saying that to a client who just really feels that they deserve an apology, maybe. You do deserve the apology.
And this idea of how a conversation would go down, an interaction, it's not, like you said, always
And the
that way.
other part that I've had to learn, and I believed that if I could talk to those people, maybe I could change their thinking enough that they would feel bad and that they could also be fixed or healed. I think that's kind of what I thought. And when those people aren't getting the help and they have their own sickness or whatever it is, they aren't going to see it the way you want them to see it. And that can be trauma on its own. And so the idea that we would need that to heal just isn't fair because they can't maybe give it to us and most of them can't, right? So we want to be in control of that. That's where you see some of those really nice stories of people who give back to society somehow differently as a way to the idea that because of a life I lived, I'm going to make this an important thing. So maybe they support a woman's shelter and that becomes a part of what they teach themselves and their family. And that's the giving back, or they really strongly get involved in advocacy for something. And that's a way that they can somehow touch or speak about or have affect on the part of their life that was negative if they choose to. That's not a part of healing. You don't have to do that. But for some people, they want to do. There are ways that they can sort of get involved in that. I always talk about Mothers Against Drunk Driving here in Canada. That was some women who were really angry that their children died to a drunk driver. And some people, that's what they do. I don't know that that's how I operate, but some people, when something bad happens, they turn that around and make it gold. And that's a different personality and a different trait. And, there are ways to
Yeah.
do that.
And helping others from healing. And like you said, that doesn't have to mean I've healed from trauma and that's what it looks like. I got to help others now, or it has to look this way, or that's what it means by resiliency. Because now I'm able to talk about it and go speak about it. Again, it looks different for everyone and it's not something you have to do. It can look different. So that's
Yeah, and that
important as
whole
well.
topic of resiliency, and that's another whole one, but the idea that often people will say, well, kids are resilient. Resilience is a concept of bouncing back, and we don't bounce back. And so to say that someone is resilient, I think that's another whole discussion. I know myself enough to know there were certain things I could not do in life because it would make me angry, because I knew I wouldn't be able to change it deeply enough. And so I had to move on from that. That was me. Other people, they want to get right in there and they want to change things. And if you've got that power and you have that scope and you have that ability, but just don't think that's what it looks like because it's different for everybody.
Exactly. Or placing resiliency with like, here are some protective factors, right? So these help when you've gone through these traumatic experience event challenges or struggles, and they helped to maybe start that healing process. Maybe it was a child who didn't feel safe at home, but felt they could be safe at school. And so I think sometimes we use the term resiliency when it's about protective factors or ways to kind of help with that process.
An ability to be in the situation you're in and yet create some kind of safety around yourself.
Yes, flourish that sense of self that you mentioned that's still there.
Yeah. Yeah. Because unfortunately, to bounce back, you have to have a sense of self. So that's where that kind of doesn't quite work. And so we want to understand. I just don't enjoy when I hear people make broad statements because they don't understand that what we hear, like we started out earlier with these comments of fight and flight and fawn, and we need to understand what those things mean in context. And that's where I think coaches and therapists come into play, because somebody can come and then we can help guide them. Or just even, so one of the things I want to get into once I'm finished up with my trauma studies is running some classes. I have this whole thing where I believe that we go to yoga and exercise classes. I want to run, and I was sort of half going to call it yoga for the mind, but I want to run classes where we talk about these things, once a month, once a week, whatever people want. And we come to a class where we talk about feelings and emotions. And so that we're starting to teach that style of thinking. When my children were young, I loved Barbara Coloroso. I don't know if you know of her. She
Yes.
has a few books. One of the things I loved about her was we want to teach our children how to think, not what to think. And that was a big banner in my mind when I raised my kids. And it's not always easy, because when you allow them to think for themselves, they don't agree with you. And so then you have to learn how to have good discussions, because you don't want to have that battle of wills. And I think the same thing with the world in general around these heavy topics. We just need to find ways to discuss them, right? and not have it be a political thing where we're going to win or lose. It just, how can we just talk about what is it that humanity wants and what slices of humanity and where do we go with it? And we start with not just clinging to big T, small t, and all of these, oh, kids are resilient or they'll be fine or it was good for me, so they'll be all right. Look, I turned out.
Yeah, the get over it kind of idea of things. But I think that's great to create that space. And again, like we mentioned earlier, where do you get the education or knowledge from around self awareness, regulation, the self? So it's great to offer groups, support opportunities for people to learn and learn more about themselves and have an understanding about how they cope and what it is that they'd like to adapt or change. And I appreciate you taking the time, Sherry, to share about how you help others, about your own journey. So thank you for sharing.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for asking. We
And I look forward to having you back on to talk about other topics and to share about the upcoming programs that you'll be offering in the new year sometime. So
Yeah,
thanks again.
appreciate it.